I never thought I'd leave that job. Back then, I worked as a night security guard at an old candy factory. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and for someone who didn't mind being alone, it was perfect. I didn't expect much to happen. I mean, who breaks into a candy factory? The place itself was outdated, half abandoned, with only a few production lines still in use during the day. By night, the silence took over, broken only by the hum of the lights and the faint ticking of the old clock in the security office. I spent my shifts watching the monitors, walking through cold, empty corridors, and counting the hours until dawn. Everything was routine until that night. It was my 5th week on the job. I remember looking at the clock, 3:03 a.m. That was usually when I started my rounds, checking the factory floor and storage areas. I took a sip of stale coffee, stretched, and glanced at the monitors. Most screens showed exactly what I expected: empty hallways, unmoving machinery, and rows of silent shelves. Then I noticed it. On one of the feeds, camera 8, aimed at the main storage corridor, something was off. At first, I couldn't figure out what. The image flickered slightly, like the camera was struggling. And then I saw him. In the middle of the corridor, perfectly still, stood a figure dressed as a clown. He was tall, his clothes faded and dirty, like something pulled from a forgotten trunk. In his right hand, he held a red balloon that seemed too bright against the dull gray of the corridor. His head tilted slightly, and though I couldn't see his face clearly, I knew he was looking straight at the camera. I stared at the screen, frozen. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. I switched to another camera, then back again. He was still there. I leaned closer to the monitor, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk. And then, slowly, the clown tilted his head to the other side, like he was acknowledging me. My heart skipped a beat. For a moment, I sat there, paralyzed. My brain scrambled for explanations. A prank? A lost worker? No, it wasn't possible. That corridor had been locked up hours ago, and I was the only one on duty. I flipped through the cameras again. Camera 8 was still showing the clown. He hadn't moved an inch, but something about him made my skin crawl, like he was more wrong than any person could be. I couldn't just sit there. I needed to know what was happening. Grabbing the flashlight and radio, I forced myself to leave the safety of the office. The factory was colder than usual that night. The smell of sugar and old machinery hung heavy in the air as I made my way to the main storage corridor. My boots echoed against the concrete floor, and the further I walked, the more uneasy I felt. When I turned the final corner and aimed my flashlight down the long hallway, my breath caught. There was no one there. The corridor was empty, just rows of shelves stretching into darkness. My flashlight beam swept over the ground. Everything was still, undisturbed. Then I saw it. A red balloon sat in the middle of the floor, tethered to nothing, gently swaying as though someone had just let it go. I stepped back, gripping the flashlight tighter. My heart thudded so hard I thought it would burst. I turned on my radio. "Control, this is Thompson. I think we might have an intruder. Something's not right here." Static. The radio crackled, but no one responded. I looked back at the balloon. It was still swaying, as if teasing me. I had to get out of there. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I spun on my heel and ran, my footsteps loud and desperate. As I neared the far door, I glanced back one last time. At the end of the corridor, in the dark, I saw him again. The clown stood motionless, watching me, the red balloon bobbing in his hand. I didn't stop running until I was back in the security office. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and sank into my chair, gasping for breath. My hands were shaking, my skin clammy with sweat. I turned back to the monitors. Camera 8 showed the corridor again. The clown was gone. I couldn't breathe. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared at the monitor, half expecting the clown to appear on another camera. I cycled through all of them, empty hallways, vacant storage rooms, and dark machinery, exactly how it should be. But I knew what I had seen. The balloon. The clown. That thing standing there, watching me. I sat at the desk, gripping the flashlight like it was a weapon. I needed to calm down, to think. It's just a prank, I told myself, my voice shaking. Someone's messing with me. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The building was locked, the factory deserted. No one else should be here. Then I heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, coming from outside the security office door. Tap, tap, tap. My breath hitched. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was tapping their fingernails on the door. I froze, my gaze locked on the handle. It didn't move, but the sound continued, slow, patient, as if whatever was on the other side was waiting for me. I stood up, moving as quietly as I could to the monitors. My hand trembled as I cycled back to camera 8. I stared at the screen, praying it would be empty. It wasn't. The clown was there again, standing right outside the security office. His face was still obscured by shadows, but I could see the red balloon bobbing slightly in his hand. The tapping stopped. I backed away from the door, feeling trapped. My only thought was to get out. I grabbed my keys, shoved them into my pocket, and turned toward the emergency exit at the far end of the office. Then the lights flickered. The humming overhead buzzed like angry wasps, casting sharp shadows across the room. The monitors glitched, static crackling on each screen. I turned toward the door again, and my heart nearly stopped. The handle began to turn slowly. No, 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 I muttered, stumbling backward. I bolted for the emergency exit, flinging the door open and sprinting into the factory. The air was freezing now, my breath clouding in front of me as I ran. The once familiar corridors felt like a maze, every corner the same. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it, the presence behind me. When I finally burst through the main entrance and into the night, I didn't stop running. I kept going until I reached the edge of the parking lot, bent over with my hands on my knees, gasping for air. I dared to look back at the factory. Through one of the dark windows, I saw it, the faint outline of the clown standing just inside, the balloon still clutched in his hand. I didn't sleep that morning. As soon as my shift ended, I marched straight into my supervisor's office. I must have looked awful, pale, eyes wide, hands still shaking, but I didn't care. "Something's wrong in that building," I said, my voice hoarse. I saw someone, a man, dressed as a clown. He was in the factory last night. My supervisor raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair with a skeptical look. "A clown? At 3 in the morning?" "Yes," I snapped. "I saw him on the cameras. He was holding a balloon. And I saw him. He followed me." He sighed, like he'd heard 100 complaints before mine. "It's probably just a prank. These old buildings attract squatters sometimes. You know that?" I shook my head. "You're not listening. The doors were locked. I checked everything. There's no way someone got in without me noticing. And yet you're saying you saw a clown." He chuckled, as if the very idea was ridiculous. "Look, Thompson, take the day off. You're probably just exhausted. Night shifts mess with people's heads." I wanted to argue, but the way he stared at me, like I was insane, made me stop. I left his office, frustrated and defeated. That night, I returned to the factory. I don't know why I agreed to go back. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it had all been in my head. That there was no clown, no balloon, no tapping on the door. For most of the night, everything was normal. I watched the monitors, walked my rounds, and tried to ignore the gnawing unease in my chest. The hours dragged on, and I let myself believe that maybe it had been a hallucination. Then, as I passed through the main corridor just before dawn, I saw it. In the center of the hallway, floating in complete stillness, was the red balloon. It hovered just above the ground, perfectly upright, as though someone had placed it there and let go. I froze. My skin crawled, and my heart thudded painfully in my chest. I glanced over my shoulder. The corridor was empty, but I felt eyes on me, a pressure in the air that I couldn't explain. I turned back to the balloon. Slowly, it began to rise, higher and higher, as though an invisible hand was lifting it toward the ceiling. I dropped my flashlight and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the security office, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely turn the key. I collapsed into the chair, gasping for breath, my eyes darting toward the monitors. Every screen showed the same thing: empty hallways. Silent. Still. But I knew the balloon had been real. I'd seen it. I'd felt it. Then the static returned. The monitors began to flicker one by one, the quiet hum of the factory drowned out by the hiss of white noise. I stared at the screens, paralyzed, as the static faded. What replaced it sent my blood cold. On every single monitor, the clown stood perfectly still. Each camera captured him from a different hallway, a different angle, but he was always there. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood in place, holding that red balloon. And then, as if to drive the final nail into my sanity, he turned his head. It happened in unison. On every screen, the clown tilted his head toward the camera, the motion slow and deliberate, like he was acknowledging me. I leapt out of the chair. No. No. My voice cracked, echoing in the small room. I backed away from the monitors, my breath shallow, my chest tight. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. I grabbed my keys, shoved the door open, and bolted into the corridor. My flashlight was gone, but the faint emergency lights guided me as I ran. The factory felt different now. Darker, colder, like it was alive and watching me. The sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythmic tapping echoed faintly through the corridors. It wasn't behind me anymore. It was in front of me. I stopped, frozen in place, as the tapping grew louder. My eyes adjusted to the shadows ahead, and that's when I saw him. The clown. He was standing at the far end of the hallway, facing me. His balloon hovered just above his hand, swaying gently as if caught by an invisible breeze. I couldn't see his face, but I didn't need to. I could feel his stare burning through me. For a second, neither of us moved. It was like the air itself held its breath. Then the clown took a single step forward, his foot scraping against the concrete floor. That was enough. I turned and ran, sprinting down corridor after corridor, twisting and turning until I saw the main exit ahead. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I hit the door with my shoulder, forcing it open, and stumbled into the cold morning air. I didn't look back. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys before throwing myself inside and locking the doors. Only then, gasping for air and drenched in sweat, did I dare to look toward the factory. Through the dusty glass of the main entrance, I saw it. The balloon. It floated there, just inside the building, as if waiting for me to return. I never went back. I quit the job that same morning, packed my things, and moved to a town hours away. I told my supervisor I couldn't explain, and to my surprise, he didn't press me. Maybe he had heard stories before. Maybe he just didn't care. To this day, I still don't know what I saw that night, what he was, or what he wanted. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. And every now and then, when I'm out late, I'll see something out of the corner of my eye. Something red, floating just above the ground. I don't know if he's still in that factory, waiting. But sometimes I think he found a way out, and he's just waiting for me to look back. Looking back now, I wish I had never taken that job. At the time, I needed work, and being the night shift security operator for an empty office building seemed like the easiest money I could earn. No crowds, no chaos. Just me, a desk, and a wall of monitors showing empty halls. The building itself wasn't anything special. Just another office complex in the middle of the city. During the day, it buzzed with people in suits, coffee cups in hand, rushing to meetings. But at night, it was a completely different place. By 10 p.m., every floor was deserted, and the silence settled in like a heavy blanket. I thought I'd enjoy it. My job was simple. Sit in the monitoring room, watch the live feeds from all 12 floors, and report any suspicious activity. For the first few nights, nothing happened. The cameras showed the same thing: empty corridors, vacant lobbies, and darkened offices. The only sound was the occasional hum of the HVAC system or my chair creaking when I shifted positions. But then I noticed something. It started during my first week, when I began to get familiar with the building's quirks: the flickering light on the third floor, the faint noise of pipes rattling in the walls. At first, I ignored it. Old buildings made sounds, I told myself. But on the fifth night, while flipping through the feeds, I saw something on the camera for the 8th floor. A door, the one at the far end of the hallway, was open. I frowned and leaned closer to the monitor. It didn't make sense. That floor had been empty for months. The offices there were abandoned after the last company moved out. I grabbed the building's blueprint file and checked. All the doors were supposed to be locked. I watched for a moment, expecting to see someone walk out, but nothing happened. The door just sat there, slightly ajar, like it was inviting me to look closer. I marked the time, 3:11 a.m. By the time my shift ended at dawn, I was unsettled. I checked the security logs from previous nights. Same door. Same time. 3:11 a.m. I convinced myself it was just a draft or faulty hinges, but curiosity gnawed at me. Why did it open at the same time every night? By the 7th night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to see for myself. At 3 a.m. I grabbed my flashlight, a walkie-talkie, and the keys to the building. I hesitated at the elevator. Taking the stairs felt safer somehow, like I'd have time to change my mind if something felt wrong. The 8th floor was pitch dark when I arrived. The flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating rows of empty desks and old chairs. The air felt wrong up there. Stale, heavy, like no one had disturbed it in years. I followed the hallway toward the door. My footsteps echoed on the linoleum, and I realized I was holding my breath. When I reached the far end, I saw it, the door. It was slightly open, just like on the camera. I pushed it gently, and it creaked as it swung inward. The beam of my flashlight revealed an office that looked like no one had set foot in it for decades. The walls were yellowed, and the desks were layered with dust. And there, in the center of the room, sat an old cassette tape on a desk. I stared at it, confused. The tape looked out of place, pristine, as if someone had just left it there. My hand shook as I picked it up. Why would anyone leave this here? I shoved the tape into my pocket and hurried back down the stairs. My pulse was racing, and I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced someone, or something, was following me. When I got back to the monitoring room, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My breathing was shallow, my forehead damp with sweat. I sat down and stared at the cassette for what felt like hours before finally grabbing the old player on the shelf. The tape hissed as it started. The screen of the monitor crackled with static. Then, slowly, an image came into focus. It was the inside of the monitoring room, my room, recorded from the perspective of someone standing in the doorway. I watched, my blood running cold, as a tall figure stepped into the frame. He was wearing a dark suit, and his face was hidden in shadows, except for his eyes, which glowed red, sharp as burning coals. The man stood perfectly still, staring into the camera. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched. Minutes passed. Hours. I watched the recording in horror, waiting for him to leave, but he never did. He never left. The air in the room felt heavier, suffocating me as the video played. My eyes were locked on the screen, my mind screaming at me to stop watching, but I couldn't look away. The figure in the recording, the man in the suit with glowing red eyes, stood in the doorway of my room. It was impossible. I was in the exact same spot, but the room around me was empty. I turned my head instinctively toward the door. It was closed, locked, but the screen told me otherwise. The man didn't move. He just stood there, frozen, his face hidden in shadow. The longer I watched, the worse it got. My chest felt tight, and my skin prickled like thousands of tiny needles were piercing me. The time on the player moved forward, an hour, then 2, yet he never left the room. What is this? I muttered to myself, sweat dripping down my temples. I fast-forwarded the tape. The static crackled, the screen distorted, but when it stabilized, the figure was still there, in the exact same spot. I stopped the tape, ejecting it with shaking hands, and let it clatter onto the desk. I leaned back, trying to steady my breath. My eyes darted toward the door again. It was still locked. I checked it 3 times, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the other side, waiting. I grabbed the tape and shoved it into a drawer, slamming it shut. I needed to distract myself, to prove to myself that nothing had changed. I switched the monitors back to the live feeds, cycling through all the floors. Empty lobbies. Dark hallways. But when I flipped to the feed for the 8th floor, my blood ran cold. The office door, the one that had been locked and abandoned, was wide open. I stared at the monitor, my heart pounding. The flashlight I'd been holding earlier was still sitting on the floor just outside the door, where I must have dropped it. But now, there was something new. A tall shadow stood in the doorway. It didn't move, but its presence on the screen was unmistakable. My throat tightened. It was him. I cycled through the other cameras, my hands shaking. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe it was a glitch. But when I flipped back to the 8th floor, he was gone. I couldn't explain what I'd seen. I sat frozen, my gaze darting between the monitors and the locked door of my room. Every sound felt amplified, the hum of the screens, the faint buzz of a light bulb, the pounding of my own heart. I told myself to calm down. "It's just a glitch," I whispered, trying to convince myself. "Just a trick of the cameras." But deep down, I knew better. The clock on the wall ticked toward 3:11 a.m. Again. I watched the time, dreading it, as though the numbers themselves carried some curse. The room felt colder now, an unnatural chill that crept into my bones. And then I heard it. A sound, faint, deliberate, like footsteps. They echoed softly, coming from somewhere outside the room. I froze in my chair, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside the door. I turned my head slowly, eyes fixed on the handle. It didn't move. The door remained locked. But the presence, I could feel it. Something was out there. I stared at the monitors, desperate for answers. I flipped back to the 8th floor feed, praying I'd see nothing. Instead, the screen was pure static. A distorted hiss filled the room, rising in volume until I could barely hear myself think. And then, through the static, a figure emerged. It was the man again, standing in the same position as before, in my room, right behind me. I whipped around in my chair, my heart ready to burst out of my chest. But there was nothing there. Just an empty room. I turned back to the monitors, sweat streaming down my face. The static was gone, and the screen showed the live feed once more. I scanned through every floor, every hallway. Empty. Silent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. The clock struck 3:12, and the temperature in the room dropped again. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare look away from the screens. I knew he was close. Somewhere, in the dark corners of the building or just outside my locked door, he was waiting. The night refused to end. I sat frozen in the monitoring room, my eyes fixed on the screens, afraid to blink. Every corner of the building was empty, but I knew better. He was there. Somewhere close, maybe even just beyond the door. The clock read 3:14 a.m. Now, but time felt meaningless. My mind was screaming for me to leave, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I couldn't shake the image of the man on the tape, standing so still, staring into the camera with those burning red eyes. The thought hit me like a hammer. What if he wasn't just on the tape? A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed the walkie-talkie, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. "Control, this is Thompson," I stammered, forcing words out of my dry throat. I need someone to come here. Now." Static crackled from the other end. No response. I tried again, louder. "Control. Do you copy?" Nothing. Only static. The silence in the room felt heavier, suffocating. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the pounding of my heart in my ears. And then, as if to mock me, the doorknob turned. It was slow, deliberate, the metallic click echoing like a gunshot. I bolted out of my chair, stumbling back against the desk. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The door didn't open, but the handle stopped turning. I stood frozen, the flashlight in my trembling hand pointed toward the door, the beam shaking with me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps on the other side of the door, pacing back and forth. "Stop it," I whispered to myself, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "This isn't real. This isn't real." The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, and then the sound came again, the static. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. The monitors flickered, each screen turning to snow. One by one, they began to show the same thing. The man in the dark suit, standing motionless in the center of the room. Only this time, he wasn't on the tape. He was in the room. The static roared in my ears as I turned, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as the light fell on him. Tall, unmoving, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the walls. His eyes, those impossible red eyes, locked onto mine. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. Then the lights flickered, and he vanished. I didn't wait. I ran. I burst out of the monitoring room, sprinting down the dark corridor toward the exit. My footsteps echoed wildly, chased by silence. I reached the door to the stairwell, flung it open, and didn't stop running until I was outside. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I kept running, my legs carrying me as far away from the building as possible. The next day, I resigned. No explanations. No excuses. I just packed up and left. I transferred to a smaller affiliate in another city far away, where I worked days and never looked at another security camera. But the memories stayed with me. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear faint static, like an old tape playing far away. Sometimes I wake up and find the door to my bedroom slightly ajar, even though I know I locked it. And sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I see a shadow. Tall. Phil. Watching me. I never found out who or what he was. I never want to. But I know this. He saw me that night. And wherever I go, he sees me still. Years ago, I worked the night shift as a bus driver. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I had grown used to the quiet hours. The streets were empty, the passengers few, and there was a strange calmness to the world at that hour. I liked the routine, until I was transferred to that line, the one the other drivers avoided. We called it the cursed route. It ran through a desolate stretch of road, surrounded by trees that seemed to stretch into nothingness. During the day, it was just an old highway, but at night, it transformed into something else. A void. A silence too deep to feel normal. At first, I thought the other drivers were exaggerating. Just stories, I told myself. I wasn't superstitious. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything out of the ordinary. But that changed on one particular night, the night I saw him. It was close to 2 in the morning, the end of my shift. I was heading back toward the garage, grateful the bus was empty, when I noticed someone at a stop. It was the last stop on the route, one that nobody used. The streetlight above flickered weakly, casting just enough light to outline a tall figure waiting there. He raised a hand, slowly, to signal the bus. I hesitated for a moment. There was no reason to stop. Who waits for a bus at that hour, in a place like that? Still, I pulled over and opened the doors. It was my job, after all. The man stepped on board. He wore a long black overcoat that seemed too heavy for the season, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. I couldn't see his eyes, his mouth, or even the tip of his nose. Just darkness. "Good evening," I said out of habit. He didn't respond. The man walked past me, his footsteps slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty bus. He went all the way to the back and sat down in the last row. I watched him through the rear-view mirror, something in my stomach twisting. There was nothing strange about him. Not yet. He was just a man, sitting silently in the back. But something about the air felt wrong. The bus felt heavier, colder. Shaking it off, I focused on the road ahead. I would drop him at the next stop, and that would be it. I told myself there was no reason to feel uneasy. But as I drove, I kept glancing at the mirror. He wasn't moving. Yet somehow, I felt he was closer. The sensation grew stronger with every mile. I tried to ignore it, but my eyes kept darting to the mirror. There he was, sitting in the same spot. And yet, it felt like he was closer. My skin prickled with unease. The bus was still empty except for him, and I knew he hadn't moved. But it didn't matter. Every time I glanced back, the space between us seemed smaller. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was the exhaustion playing tricks on me. My shifts were long, and I'd heard of people hallucinating when tired enough. The air inside the bus grew colder. I turned up the heater, but the chill refused to leave. My breath misted in front of me, and for the first time, I noticed the silence, absolute and heavy. Even the low hum of the engine sounded muffled, like it was being swallowed by something unseen. Then the radio crackled. It was faint at first, just a whisper of static, but it grew louder. The sound was harsh, grating, like nails scraping against glass. I twisted the dial to shut it off, but nothing happened. "Come on," I muttered, hitting the console. The static stopped as suddenly as it started, and in the sudden silence, I heard something else, the slow, rhythmic creak of a seat. I froze. Slowly, my eyes lifted to the rear-view mirror. My chest tightened as I stared into the reflection. The man was still in his seat, but he was leaning forward now, just enough to make his silhouette sharper. His hat still obscured his face, but I could feel his gaze. It was like his eyes were boring into me, even though I couldn't see them. I swallowed hard. "Sir," I called out, my voice shaking, "this is the last stop coming up. You'll need to get off soon." Nothing. He didn't move. I felt my throat go dry. My hands were clammy against the steering wheel, and the chill in the air sank into my bones. I needed him off my bus. I didn't care if he was a weirdo, or if I looked like a fool. I just needed him to leave. I pulled the bus over to the side of the road, the brakes hissing in protest. The stop was empty, but it didn't matter. I had to get him out. I stood up from the driver's seat and turned toward the back of the bus. "Sir, this is..." The words died in my throat. The seat was empty. I blinked, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The seat he had been sitting in was completely vacant. I walked slowly down the aisle, my boots echoing against the floor. The air felt heavier the closer I got to the back. When I reached the last row, I stared at the seat. I touched it and felt warmth. The seat was still warm. I stumbled back from the seat, my heart pounding. My fingers were still tingling from the warmth, a warmth that shouldn't have been there. I turned on my heel and hurried back to the front of the bus, refusing to look over my shoulder. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, gripping the wheel with trembling hands. "It's just exhaustion. I'm seeing things." I started the engine again, forcing the bus back onto the empty road. The hum of the motor felt reassuring, breaking the eerie silence. I focused on the highway stretching endlessly ahead, refusing to look in the rear-view mirror. Then I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate knocks. The sound didn't come from inside the bus. It came from outside, on the window beside me. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned my head, terrified of what I might see. There, just beyond the glass, stood the man. The same overcoat, the same hat. He was standing in the middle of the dark road, impossibly still, facing the bus. I slammed my foot on the brake, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The bus skidded to a stop. My chest heaved as I tried to make sense of it. How could he be outside? How could he have? The knocks continued. Knock, knock, knock. I forced myself to look back at the window. The man hadn't moved an inch. He was still there, staring at me. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes locked on me, boring through the glass and into my skull. I couldn't take it anymore. With a trembling hand, I grabbed the door controls and swung the doors open. "Get out of here!" I shouted into the night, my voice hoarse and desperate. "Leave me alone." But he didn't move. He stood there, completely still, like a statue carved from shadow. Then, as if to taunt me, I saw something in the corner of my eye, the rear-view mirror. He was sitting at the back of the bus again. I gasped and turned around. The aisle was empty, but I could still feel him. The pressure in the air, the icy chill, it was like he was everywhere at once. I slammed the doors shut and hit the accelerator, the bus lurching forward. My only thought was to get away. Away from the stop. Away from that man. Away from whatever was happening. But the knocks didn't stop. This time, they echoed from inside the bus. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The bus roared down the empty highway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my hands slick with sweat. My mind was screaming for answers, but none came. How could someone be outside and inside at the same time? How could any of this be happening? The knocks grew louder, sharper, like fists pounding against the metal frame of the bus. Bang, bang, bang. "Stop it!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "Leave me alone." The sound stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence and the hum of the engine. I let out a shaky breath, but I knew it wasn't over. I could still feel him, a presence, an emptiness that sucked the warmth out of the air. And then the lights flickered. The fluorescent bulbs overhead buzzed and dimmed, plunging the bus into near darkness. The headlights sputtered, and for a split second, the road ahead disappeared. I hit the brakes, the bus shuddering to a stop. The engine sputtered and died. The lights went out completely. "No, no, no," I muttered, fumbling for the ignition. I turned the key, but the engine only groaned in protest. The bus was dead. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps moving down the aisle, coming closer. I didn't dare turn around. I could hear them so clearly, like someone walking across a wooden floor. Step after step, closing the distance between us. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The footsteps stopped. The air felt heavier, colder. It was like the entire bus was holding its breath. I slowly turned my head to look at the rearview mirror. He was standing right behind me. The man in the overcoat was close enough to touch, his hat casting his face in shadow. I could see the outline of his shoulders, the heavy fabric of his coat, and the way his presence seemed to distort the air around him. Then, finally, he moved. He leaned closer, the brim of his hat tilting forward until I could almost see his face. I slammed my hand against the ignition and twisted the key. The engine roared to life. The lights flickered back on, and I hit the gas, the bus lurching forward. I didn't look back. Not this time. I kept my eyes on the road, my foot pressed hard on the pedal. The knocks had stopped. The footsteps were gone. But I knew he was still there. Somewhere in the shadows of the bus. Watching. Waiting. The garage was only a few miles ahead. I just had to make it there. The road to the garage felt endless. My hands shook on the wheel, my knuckles white, my breathing ragged. The headlights carved their way through the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, that he was watching me from somewhere just beyond my sight. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again. I couldn't risk it. The knocks had stopped. The footsteps had vanished. The bus was silent now, except for the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of my heart pounding in my ears. But the air still felt heavy, as though his presence lingered, just waiting for me to let my guard down. Finally, I saw it, the garage. It was dimly lit, but I didn't care. The building had never looked so welcoming, so safe. I gripped the wheel tighter, forcing the bus forward until I rolled into the lot and slammed on the brakes. The engine shuddered and died. For a long moment, I just sat there. I was shaking so badly I couldn't move, my forehead resting against the steering wheel. I told myself it was over. I had made it. I was safe. But then, the silence was broken. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was soft this time, almost gentle, but it came from behind me. I froze. "Don't look," I whispered to myself. "Don't turn around." But I couldn't help it. Slowly, as if in a trance, I lifted my head and looked into the rearview mirror. The bus was empty. The rows of seats stretched out behind me, silent and still. There was no sign of him. No overcoat, no hat, no shadowy figure lingering in the darkness. But I knew better. I grabbed my bag and stumbled out of the bus, desperate to leave. My shoes scraped against the concrete floor of the garage as I ran inside. The warmth of the building was a relief, but it didn't last. Even as I stood there, gasping for breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something with me. A colleague on the night shift spotted me. "Hey, you good?" he called, frowning. I tried to answer, but my voice wouldn't come. I just nodded and turned away, forcing myself to move. I needed to get out of there, out of the garage, out of that place. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. I kept hearing those knocks, 3 soft, deliberate taps, echoing through my apartment when I was alone. And sometimes, when I glanced into the mirror, I thought I saw the faint outline of a man in a hat standing just behind me. I quit the job a week later. I told them it was stress, that I couldn't handle the night shifts anymore. They didn't ask questions. Maybe they'd heard similar stories before. It's been years since that night, but it still haunts me. I still hear the knocks in my dreams, and sometimes I wake up to find my room colder than it should be. I don't drive buses anymore. I don't even take them. But every now and then, when I'm out late and I see a bus roll by on an empty street, I can't help but look at the back window. I never see anyone sitting there, but I always wonder, is he still riding? Waiting for the next driver to take the cursed route? To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.